Forgot I was hungry until we started. So
No problem. Hey, this is Going South. We're doing a part 2 today. I'm excited to have Dr. Kris Macomber back with us. We had a great conversation about rape culture, and we wanted to continue some of that. We realized after the fact that there were a lot of things that we actually didn't get to talk about. So we've been talking for weeks about doing kind of a part 2. Just to kind of remind everybody, Dr. Macomber got her PhD in sociology from North Carolina State. She teaches at Meredith College, where she's associate professor now.
Yep.
Just got promoted,
Yep.
right? So congratulations on that. She's the vice president of Work for Change, a consulting firm kind of based in Raleigh, I guess, that really works with organizations of multiple sizes around kind of humanizing work. I love the way y'all phrase that, right? Like, how do we humanize work? And they do a lot of stuff around equity as well. She is what I would consider kind of a critical theorist, specifically as it relates to kind of gender and masculinity and race. Those are some of her areas. Kris, am I leaving anything out?
No, I would just say that Work for Change is not really Raleigh based, just sort of virtual. So we're everywhere. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, in fact, you just had your first like international client too.
Yeah, international. Yeah. So we are remote, virtual.
Cool.
Boundless.
That's right. In the world of Zoom. So
yeah, for sure.
So needless to say, she's a really busy person. So it's I always enjoy our conversation. So I appreciate you wanting to continue what we started.
Yeah.
And we were talking about stuff before we started recording. So
yeah.
Where do you want to jump off on? Because we're just talking about change and theories.
Yeah. Well, I think we could maybe reorient to just rape culture, like real quick, if we could just kind of reframe that. So for folks who might not know what rape culture is, it's the normalization of sexual violence in our culture, particularly men's sexual violence against women. And that manifests in a variety of ways. We talked about laws last time, how, we have really archaic patriarchal rape laws that we've inherited, and we're kind of slowly chipping away at making those better and more equitable and, lending themselves less to sexual violence. And so we talked about laws, we talked about different cultural practices and language and how the words we use construct meaning and can often be illustrative of dominance and power, and we talked about things like boys will be boys, or saying things like that, like those sort of linguistic things we do to minimize sexual violence and really give men permission to be sexually aggressive. So that was some of the conversation points we talked about last week. And then last time we were chatting. And then there was just so many things after that I had thought about, because it's really complicated. Like rape culture is a really complicated feature of society, and it's so multifaceted. Like we didn't talk about pornography and the way that we live in a culture now where like pornography is mainstream, and how the sexual objectification of women, and I would say people in general, is just so exploitive, and what that means for our views of sexuality and how it kind of distorts young people's minds and their imagination about what sex is and what human intimacy is. So we didn't get into that sort of rabbit hole later too about porn. And the other thing that I did want to talk about, if we can get to it, is, when I teach about issues like race, I have a day where I say, okay, this is the Jesus is not white day, where we talk about like the sort of whitewashing of history and how we've sort of like centered white culture and, pray to a white Jesus with blue eyes, and how historically and geographically inaccurate that is. Well, in a similar vein, I have a day where I say, Brock Turner is a pretty nice guy. And then I'll say, okay, what is that?
Who's Brock Turner?
Brock Turner was the young man who raped a woman who was unconscious, and then he was it got a lot of right. And got a really short sentence. And then the sort of what's important about that case is the public response about Brock Turner and how people said, oh, he's this white, came from like a affluent family and was a successful up and coming athlete. And people were like, oh, and someone had penned a letter a good friend of his, a good female friend, and it went, probably viral. It was this open letter about what a good friend he is.
Right.
And his dad wrote a letter to the judge about, like, my son is such a good person. And during that time, students are trying to reckon with, like, no, he's hideous. He's a monster. So what I had to say was, well, in a rape culture where sexual violence is normalized and where, men get sort of a lot of social accolades for being sexual aggressors,
Yeah.
Brock Turner can be a good son and a great friend, and he can rape someone. That's kind of what, when we unpack that, like, we want to demonize. We talked last time about the fear of the monster, like the creepy guy jumping out of the bush is what we think of as rape. Like, actually, no, it's common. It's coercing someone to, force them to have sex with you. It's Brock Turner. It's someone who can be nice and likable and a good student, a great son, a great friend, and sexually exploit someone because it is cultural. That's what it means. So, and students, sometimes, and I think people in general want to resist that notion that you can, force someone to have sex with you, but also be a good person. And that's like a tough pill to swallow for people. So I don't know if we want to go deeper into that.
Well, I mean, it's something that I'm sure you've taught a lot about in gender, this kind of, we are a binary culture, right? Where you're a Democrat or you're a Republican, you're black or you're white, you're gay or you're straight, you're rich, you're poor, you're dumb, you're smart, right? When in fact, reality is a spectrum, right? And I don't know what it is about us that, and maybe it's just because of the culture where, I think the world would be a much better place if we all were capable of fessing up and being introspective about how potentially creative and wonderful and loving we can be, and potentially destructive, cruel, and indifferent we can be, because we are both those things, I would argue.
Well, and I think binaries are convenient and limiting, right? I mean, we have them not just like Democrat, Republican, which I know we've talked about, and how that limits the way we even think about what we can be and who we can be. And even with masculinity and femininity, right? When most people, when you ask them how they identify with characteristics, most people fall somewhere in the middle of like identifying with, what we consider masculine and feminine, which are social constructions. Right. And then, but we have these binaries, and binaries are always constructed in opposition to each other. So like, we're not feminine because we're masculine, right? So we even use that term opposite sex. Like, it's not just different, we say opposite, which means I'm not that and you're not that. And binaries are just, they're designed with this inherent tension built into it. Like, Democrats are not Republicans, right? Because they don't like this. Republicans are not Democrats because they don't like that. Rather than having a conversation about, well, what are your values? That's why I don't like labels either, because labels are, it just shuts down conversations. We just say, like, instead of saying I'm a Democrat, what's important to you? What kind of world do you want to see? What values do you care about? How do you vote? What issues do you really rally behind? That's more important than just a label.
Yeah, the other part that you're kind of making me think of too is that what we do in the example of Brock or whoever does something right that's a violation of a social norm is we paint them as one thing totally, right? So we negate everything about them that's good and encouraging or whatever else. But it seems to me it's also a way of getting it to individualizing it instead of it being our culture, right? Back to that Brock isn't simply a product of his culture, right? So Brock is an individual. We have to hold him accountable and so forth, right? But if we're really going to deal with why Brock is behaving the way he is, we've got to change the culture.
Right. Well, because the idea that it's a pathology, right, that it's an individual pathology makes us feel better, because then we can just put those people away. We have a whole system for that. We've got prisons. Then we can just put them away, isolate them, forget about them. But if we have to reckon with the fact that what are the conditions under which thousands of Brock Turners are engaging in that kind of behavior, then that's a fundamentally different kind of question.
And he got caught.
What's that?
And he just got caught.
Yeah, and he just got caught because two people saw him and intervened at what was happening. So yeah, I mean, it's like, it's the structural versus individual. And we see this with violence in general, which is one of the points that I felt like one of the parallels that I wanted to draw was like rape culture doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's connected to the reality that we live in a very violent culture in general. If we think about the way that our country formed, the genocide, slavery, I mean, there's no lack of examples of about just violence in general, and domination and colonizing people, exploiting them for resources, exploiting them for, humanity, whether we're talking about, in a economic sense. So the fact that we live in a culture that normalizes sexual violence, we really shouldn't be scratching our heads going, how, why? Like, we shouldn't be dumbfounded about it, right? There's evidence as to what that connects to. We think about mass violence, gun violence. We watch people fight in cages. We pay to watch people fight each other in cages.
Now women can do that, so we have equality.
So now there's equality, right? Which, yeah, so that, and I think that's what's impeding change, is that we think that that is equality. And that's something that we talked about earlier. It's like, how do you create change? Like, you can't actually make systems change by trying to fix the problems without addressing the root of the problem, right? Without just trying to say, well, let's just make it better. You have to say, well, how did it get there? And let's try to find a better way.
Well, it seems to me that, like, it's almost like AA. You can't address the problem until you acknowledge there's a problem, right? Kind of a thing. And we're, as a nation, unwilling to do that. At the same time, and I'd really love to know what you think about this, is that I've been thinking about our political work on a local level and how there's no process. People have to continue to lie about what they did because they're afraid of loss of political power, or they're afraid of being litigated against. Right? So if they admit they brutalized somebody in an arrest, right, then they might be legal, and they're ironically, they're being legally held accountable anyway. But we don't culturally have, I think about forgiveness, right, and atonement, and we really aren't good at those things, really. You know what I mean? In addition to denying and individualizing this as these are failed pathological individuals, we really have no means for restitution, reconciliation culturally, right? And I've often wondered about that. I think, and tell me if you've seen it, but like, I've always just felt that there is a vacuum in terms of people modeling publicly that, I've got sexism in me, and I think we talked about this last time when Trump kind of got thrown under the bus about the crotch grabbing when he was bragging about sexually assaulting women. I don't know how many liberal men and conservative men I knew like slammed him for it, but I can tell you in my lifetime, I've heard worse, I've seen worse, right? And we don't acknowledge that. There's a way that we even distance ourselves from him. And it seems to me that quote unquote liberal progressive men, we ought to start telling the truth. And I bring that up, whether it's around race or around any way we dehumanize other folks that really isn't the core of who we are. Again, it's just what we've been taught to say and think and feel. Right. But I've wondered if there were more models of folks saying, I've got racism. I mean, it's not all of who I am, but shit, why wouldn't I? I'm from a place that said Jesus was white. I'm from a place where a white man brings you presents. I'm in a place where everything that I was taught said that white men have done anything worth knowing. Like, how can I not think white people are superior, right? In addition to then talking about how I've manifested that. So, I mean, I guess it's a question, Kris, like, I mean, I just don't see those models publicly, like in a way that would diffuse or counteract and push back against this idea that somebody is the sum of one action, right?
Well, and I think some of that is because we live in such a punitive centric, our response is punitive, right? We have a system of mass incarceration that eats like families, communities, neighborhoods for breakfast and has, right? And that's not natural. That was by design, right? That was created that way through policy.
And it's also lucrative.
And it's lucrative. It's a business. Like people, there's vendors, there's security companies that make money, the food distribution companies, the people making the clothes. I mean, it's like a huge business. It's $1 billion business. So, but I think our response is punitive, and that bleeds over. It doesn't just stay in the criminal justice system. That whole ethos, the whole mindset, the whole sort of like vision that supports the criminal justice system has bled over into the way look at how we police children in schools. That society has become more militarized. We have a punitive approach to problems when children misbehave, even the language that we use in schools, right? So they've become more carceral settings. And I think that reaction prevents us, which is why restorative justice is so, I think, promising, because it says you've done something wrong, but let's restore a sense of humanity on both parts. The person who's the victim of the crime, but also the person who offended, because something happened to them. Like something happened to them in that moment, and let's restore a part of their humanity, if they violated somebody in some way. And I think the punitive approach we have bleeds over into the way we don't recognize that we're full human beings, because we want to, lock them away, throw them, just kind of isolate people. It shuts it down. You don't have to have a conversation then.
Well, I think this is the kind of rights critique of like doxing and deplatforming and woke culture, right? Like, and why people are afraid to say anything, because there might not, the perception is that there's no room to make a mistake. Not that I see conservative folks willing to say they made a mistake, right? But it seems silencing to me in a way. But I guess, again, given as much as we now know about this, as many courses, and having worked with men who were adjudicated for violence, right, and thinking about my own kind of controlling behaviors and relationships in other ways, witnessing folks fess up to stuff was powerful. Just not only empowering, but it gave permission. It did a couple of things. It basically lets you know that you're not alone, that you're not this pathological person, right? That in fact you're in a room full of people in a world full of men that often think women are objects, right? Or children are objects for your control and whatever else. And I guess I don't know exactly what I'm trying to articulate. I think you see it on the right and the left, that where are the folks that are, where's the space to be human, and how do you create that? Would it matter? In my little whiteness film, for some reason, it's been blowing up. So it's up to almost 400,000 views and 3,000 comments. And it's a film about white people fessing up about being white, right? And the comments are very informative, because it's framed as anti-white. It's framed as self-loathing and communist bullshit. Like, and nobody ever deals with the content of what people are saying when these white folks are saying, hey, when I get pulled over by the cops, I just don't get a ticket, and I speed all the time. Like, so I even as I say this to you, that maybe if we were telling the truth and not confessing, or whatever you want to call it, right? The dominant culture still pushes back in these ways, because it totally seems threatening to hegemony.
Well, and we want to put a price tag on it. Yeah, no, it absolutely does. It's like, those are powerful films because it's conversation. It's people opening up because you're asking them questions, right? You're having that moment where they're being candid and, honest, probably, right, about things that maybe make them uncomfortable. And we don't want to talk about those things. And I'm more worried about what's going to happen in the future with, social media and just mass media in general. I think we're losing more of that sort of candidness, which is why documentary work, I think, is so powerful and can be, because, people get a chance to just, share their story. And we don't get to do that when things are automated and, highly technologically advanced. Like, not to be all doom and gloom, but I definitely fear that we're getting less connected to each other as time goes on.
Well, I just wonder if we know how to connect too. I mean, particularly younger generations than me. Like, connection means a social media connection for a lot of people, versus what does it mean to have dialogue and conversation for long periods of time, or to recognize the humanity in somebody that you might totally disagree with, but also recognize, and I've been guilty of this. Like, I felt like in our little Confederacy movie, I felt like in some ways we painted people very one-dimensionally, because they support this kind of racist historical narrative. And at the same time, some of them are grandmothers and grandfathers, and
Right.
they're people, right? They're not, well, and the irony for me is that, when you talk about homophobia, liberals have always said it's just tragic that gay folks would be dismissed for their sexuality, which is just a small part of who they are, right? But we do that with people politically all the time. Now that's not to excuse people, I think, that want to hurt us or to perpetuate, cruelty, but yeah, I don't,
I think we sell people short, right? I mean, I know what you mean, but if you were doing a deep dive into like one family, you could do that, right? You could say, like, we're going to show a family and like they love to do these reenactments, but they also do these other wonderful things. You know what I mean? Like, you could, but when you're doing like a trajectory of showing like a broad sort of framework, it's kind of hard to go deep into the nuances of the human spirit, or whatever.
Well, and as far as documentaries go, I'm so burned out on them because I don't see many anymore that are very complicated. And I've been guilty of this. Like, most seem to have an axe to grind versus really, covering the complicated nature of most phenomena,
Well, there's different genres, right? Some docs are meant to be that. They're meant to be, educational advocacy. Like, there's a problem here. We're going to shine a light on the problem, and we're going to bring in, people who have been impacted by the problem, and we're going to really ride that train real hard and fast, But yeah, I mean, I'm sure there, I haven't watched any lately. I've been on a book kick, not a film kick, but just in terms of telling stories, that I think need to be told. Maybe you need to make a documentary, Mark, about the complexities of the human condition.
I'm not sure it'd sell. Like, I think this is the other problem, right? That there's a filtration process already, because I would say this about news. Do people really want to get a spectrum of information about an issue, or are we all addicted to being outraged and feeling like we're right and the other side is the enemy? And it feels like we're already there. I had a conversation with Lee. Her father's, a lifelong Republican, and we're just having talking about this, and I asked him how he's in his 70s and what he thinks about the state of the country, and he essentially said, I think we're kind of 1920s Germany, and what he means by is the polarization, that we're rapidly approaching a place where incredible harm can be done because the other side is no longer human. Right. And I see that locally, like, and I'm not sure what you can do when people have already drawn conclusions about your lack of humanity, and that you are the enemy that has to be dealt with. And not only that, they have God on their side in the process of doing it, and nationalism in the process of doing it as well.
Yeah, because there's a righteousness that comes with that, and a certainty and unwillingness to hear or to see anything that does not confirm what you already are steeped in. And that is dangerous. I mean, that's when violence, is inevitable, justified, activated.
But it's not violence, it's freedom fighting.
Right.
It's defending your country. It's combating communism, even when people aren't communists.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, because if you believe that they are, and everything you hear is that they are, and that thing that they are is bad and threatens your life and threatens the lives of your children.
Or just your way of life. I think that's what I see is that, mask wearing is a threat to somebody's way of life, and I don't know what the fuck that means. Like, I get what it means, but it's not like, people are pounding on your doors to get your guns and, the rest. But
no,
I don't know where I'm going with this, but I just, to kind of get back to kind of dominant culture, because that's what drives most of this, right? Like, and also the issue of change, and what kind of change, right? Again, do we, do we just want reform, or do we want a different world, a different community, different institutions? This kind of gets into, and not that we have to go down this road, but I love the kind of slogan y'all have about work for change, right? What does it mean to humanize work?
Right.
And I would argue that humanization needs to happen, and that's what we're really talking about: humanizing other people that we disagree with, and hopefully being seen as a competent human ourselves when we talk about this stuff.
Right. And so part of it is like, what would a workplace look like that was grounded in principles of social justice, right? Like if you were taking
a community
look like, right. Like for work for change, it's like bringing that lens, right? But what does a community look like if we were to start over, right? And I often would ask my students, like, if resources meant nothing, like, just talk about ideas right now. Like, if we were to create a society that was equitable and just, what would it look like? How would our systems look? How would our institutions look? How would culture be different? Like, just create a model of society. And it's really exciting for them to think through that.
But can we, like, can I
what, create new?
Well, no, it seems to me that even with those questions in place, that there's a framework and a value system and an ideological stance that defines what success is, defines what resources are. You know what I mean? Like, well, it's the struggle I have locally in other places where social justice is equated by default with social mobility.
Right.
And I don't think those things are the same. And I'm not, and we should talk about what social mobility means, and is that a byproduct of a particular ideology?
Right. Like, getting more a piece of the pie, is that your like outcome for success? Is that your sign of progress? Like, what is progress? How do you measure change and success and equity? Is it just getting more piece of the pie?
Or getting a position of power in an institution that's oppressive, or in a nation that might not be the most humanitarian politically, internally or externally, right?
Right. Well, and that's what, I've been thinking a lot about, with everything being automated and robotics. And I really feel afraid for that, because even though we are not doing a great job as humans in interrupting, work that's not dignified, communities that are, not just, and that are just degrading to people, we have the opportunity to reflect. We have agency. We have that moment when we can interrupt something. What?
Do we?
We have it's in us. We have the opportunity to disrupt, because we have reflection. That's what makes us, we can reflect on things. An automated machine is never going to reflect on things. It's never going to. It's going to pump out a whole bunch of shit in a really fast amount of time. It's going to increase productivity, but it will never be able to have that moment of human reflection that presents the opportunity to disrupt something, to take it a different way. You do it all the time. I do it all the time. And we have moments where we go against the status quo. So when we replace that person with a machine, that moment of reflection is gone. Like, it's not there because it's impossible for a machine to reflect and to have that moment of introspection. So I'm not here to bring optimism, that's for sure. I see more.
That's okay.
I'll wait in line for an hour for the person so I can have like a 30-second conversation with them at the, because I'm like, oh, I like having 30-second short conversations. Then go where you can like do it yourself and automate it, or I don't like that for a lot of reasons. But not only for the capital, not only for that reason, because it's putting people out of work, but because of what you were also missing, the human connection. And yeah, so that's a whole other conversation probably, but.
Well, no, I think this goes back to something we talked about the first time we chatted. And these are, again, radical propositions, but I still just kind of still operate from these kind of critical questions of, if I grow up in a society that teaches me white people are superior in so many deliberate and unintentional ways, right? If I grow up in that same society, it teaches me women and anybody not male is inferior. If I grow up in a society that teaches me I'm only of value based on what I produce or what I accumulate, right? Like, I have no existential grounding and experience where, I mean, maybe momentary, like, personal interactions with my sister or my mom where I realize, oh, these are people just like me, right? But oftentimes teach me patriarchy, and sexism, right? It seems to me that even when we're judging the system, we're using the system's framework to often judge it if we're not careful. And it raises those questions of, are we capable of experiencing each other as fully human, given and not only that, even ourselves. I mean, Marx talked about different kinds of alienation, and one was right from one another, right? But there was also alienation from the work we do, nature, as well as ourselves, right? And so I keep harping on the idea that we're all kind of in need of recovery. Like, what does it mean to recover my humanity in a capitalist society where I'm trained to take advantage of people monetarily if I can? I'm trained, instead of helping people and sharing when I have fortunate windfalls. Does that?
Yeah, well, and I've been thinking a lot more recently about nature and our viewpoint that we're above it and over it rather than a part of it. That we're linked to it. It's like that, or that we're not nature, right? That we are separate from nature. And actually, the book that I sent you, there's a couple of conversations in there about that, where that is sort of like second guessed, right? Saying like we think we like are in control of nature, or that it's here and we're up here, but it's like, no, like aren't we wild too? Like, aren't we a part of that? So I mean, you're asking really good, important questions, that are saying like, is it possible in the culture that we're in? I mean, and I'm not someone who's like, I definitely believe that change is possible because it already has happened. Like, we're always changing. Society has changed already a lot. It's always evolving. And I think
but is it evolving though? Like, it's clear to me that everything is
devolving.
Like, it's doing something. It's changing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, more like moving, right? Things are shifting. Things are changing. I'm glad.
Can I use a historical moment and just see what you think about it? Like, when in 2008, I'm assuming you voted for Barack Obama.
The first, probably. I don't. Yeah, probably.
I did.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, holy cow, I've been really wrong. Like if you would have told me 8 years before that I would see a biracial or a Black president in my lifetime, I would have laughed. Right. And I think a lot of folks in the country thought this is a watershed moment. Right. And I remember feeling, oh, all this work we've done is coming to fruition. Right. I mean, years and years and years of work. Right. And then we have 8 years of Barack Obama, who's pretty much a moderate. He's a moderate Republican in the 1970s. You know, somebody who's old that remembers moderate Republicans. And you know, not radical, not really wholesale scale change in any sense of the word. Not to disrespect him, he's in a machine, right?
Well,
but
to be where you are, you have to play. Yeah.
But but some problematic policies, right? Folks of color aren't really much better off after 8 years. But then we get Donald Trump. Within 4 years, we have an insurrection on the Capitol of the United States. We have a massive right-wing movement that's very much alive and really wants to take the nation back to a prior day. It's really a I think we'd agree on a backlash to the change of the last 40 years around women's rights, around gay folks, around trans issue, whatever, right? It's really all of which is probably terrified a lot of folks, right? Because it's social change and humans don't like change. None of us do, myself either, right? We want the same cereal in the same place at the same grocery store,
right? Routinized,
But so here we are, and what I also see happening. I don't know if you like. I was in a lawyer's office, a week and a half ago, who hands me a newsletter from a conservative college that I think he's alumni of, that's about why we've got to fight CRT, critical race theory.
I've been hearing about,
right.
I'm hearing about it a lot.
And I'm thinking, I remember when Trump basically criminalized it at the federal level, I was just thinking, that's what I teach, So it's all changed, right? But in terms of evolving, I don't know. And many of us would just say, look, the DNA of the country, what it really has been, it's a struggle. It's a human struggle, and depended on whether we get involved in this moment or not, and I fear enough people won't, will determine the direction the country goes, and whether or not Lee's father's right, whether or not we go down the road, especially in the next election cycle or two.
Well, I think the fact that we're so polarized, more than, I'm in my early 40s, so, and certainly in my lifetime, it hasn't been this bad, in terms of the binary hate. I hesitated when you asked about 08, because I honestly could have written someone in 08, and I don't remember. That's why, I was an independent, because of the whole two-party system, I think is part of the whole problem. So I didn't. I was like, I'm independent. So that's why I hesitated. Just to be clear, I would not have voted Republican. I just wanted to make that point clear. It would be, maybe I was like, I probably did. I might have written someone else in back then in 08. But I just wanted to say it wouldn't have been that I voted, as a Republican. So just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, no worries. And so, and as I put all that kind of gloom and doom stuff out, I would also say, though, and we feel this at the local level with the work, when you get subpoenaed for speaking at a public meeting, something's happening, in terms of power. I would argue the backlash is really because some things have been threatened.
I was going to say that's threat. That's like what threat feels like in action is that.
Yeah, and we can expect pushback, and as Susan Faludi said, backlash, right? White lash, or Vernon Jones. and we're kind of in the midst of it, but
so where do nonprofits come in? Let's get into that conversation. Because we had talked about, these advocacy organizations, the sort of promises and pitfalls, or opportunities and obstacles. I mean, I'm like a word nerd, so I'm just thinking in titles, but there's a lot of critique about nonprofits. We've had these, conversations about what the intention is, and a lot of people would say they're going to get involved in social change work by working for a nonprofit. So what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, I think it's more commodification, right? Like, and the folks who've taught me about organizing, and I'm not a good one, but argue that basically I want to say the 501c3 tax designation was created in the 50s at the height of the civil rights movement. And it was kind of framed, at least in some people's thinking, as a way to quell social change, right? To at least manage it. So and let's just be clear, most nonprofits of any magnitude are getting corporate money, right? They're getting corporate funds that corporations then write off and publicize that they support, through their foundation, right? But and I've been a part of nonprofits. I've been the ED in a couple of nonprofits. I just think they're deeply problematic. And when we've got now probably 2 generations of people that think that is how change is going to happen, I think they're really great if you want to service a social situation. So if you want to have a soup kitchen, if you want to Meals on Wheels, if you want to do Habitat for Humanity, but and I would also argue that they're predatory, like the worst of them.
How so? And what?
Well, when you go into, like here at least, and other places I've lived, when nonprofits are created from outside of the communities they serve, right, by somebody who doesn't suffer from the struggles of that community, when they don't hire from the communities they serve, when they don't put people in those communities on their boards of directors and steering committees, when that community has no idea of where the money comes from, how much comes from, who's getting paid, when you can create a nonprofit without having any analysis whatsoever of how the community got the way it is, why it's, and only that, your relationship to that history, right? But so you don't have to have a diagnosis other than the one you tell the funder, and then you go in and do something. I think they're at worst, a substitute for justice, and well-intended people oftentimes, but I've also seen well-intended people learn in workshops and, with critical consultants that, look, what you're doing is actually oppressive if you're not utterly transparent and inclusive. Right. And last but not least, I'll shut up after I say this, like here, especially, most nonprofits I know brag about serving more people every year or growing. Like our food bank guy fucking brags all the time about how many more people they serve. So is our United Way guy. And that you're admitting failure in some way, unless you just want to serve a growing number of disenfranchised people. So they're not radical in the sense of getting at the roots of why there's a shortage of food or a shortage of how, you know my spiel on this, like, and people in the nonprofit world get really fucking angry when you raise these questions, which to me reveals their own supremacy and motivation, unless they're like, if you're really about serving the folks, you should embrace a critical analysis of our work, right? And then we're going to do whatever to fix it and be inclusive and be transparent. Like we and not only that, get at the roots of why these issues exist. I just think it's a way to commodify and basically harvest people from communities that are under siege and have been for decades.
Right, and who should be grateful for the people who are coming in, who are experts, who presumably know what's best for them.
Yeah.
It reminds me of the white saviorism critiques, right? the majority of nonprofits are led by white people and are serving predominantly communities of color.
Yeah.
So there's this, reliance on white credibility, white legitimacy, white authority. And also, I think an entitlement of white people of their access, like that you're just going to go into a community that you don't live in, that you don't really know anything about, and people are going to want you to help, that they're going to want to be receptive and grateful to your help. And if they're not grateful and receptive, you kind of have feelings about that as you're driving back to your middle-class neighborhood in your middle-class car, right? Out of that neighborhood that you don't know anything about, but who should be grateful for your expertise about their plight. It makes me think of that saying, and I've looked up who says this, and I can't find a person like the root, but those closest to the pain should be the closest to power. And that's not the way that most nonprofits might have a board member or two who is of the community, but mostly it's people professional.
They're selected strategically. Generally, it's the people that are going to pat the nonprofit on the back and will say all the right things when you have the site visit and the funders there. They're grateful. They're not critical.
Right.
And for the record, folks of color are doing this now to communities of color. Like there's classism as well. So, a lot of folks of color have figured out the game, right? And in my experience, aren't any more receptive than white folks when it comes to, are we pimping the community if we're not fully including and taking direction from the folks most directly impacted by mass incarceration, by, no housing, and the rest. So white folks have certainly been at the forefront of it, but now I see folks of color who are going to get their middle class lifestyles based on doing the same thing.
Yeah, I would say it's more of a class issue, right, than it is, it's a middle class approach, which is service provision. So at the same time, and I think it's really important to critique that, right, that approach, and to critique the nonprofit model. I do believe that we still need services provided to people. Like we've had this conversation many times. Like I want someone at that right crisis center providing, I want that forensic nurse. I want that funding so that there is a rape advocate on campus. You know what I mean? So while we're working to prevent the structural conditions that are creating all of these problems, there are people in need who are hungry, whose kids need to eat. You know what I mean? So like we need the prevention and structural root problem solving, but we also need, while we're working to do that, we have to help people while we can, when we can. And I think some people feel called to do that work. So
yeah, well, you're talking really crisis management, right? Whether it's about sexual assault or the need for food,
hunger. Right.
Absolutely. I guess the thing I've seen though over the years, even with men's violence work, I remember being, working with an organization that, when we went to the first Gulf War, they couldn't talk about violence on a national scale, which fucking war is perpetrated by men, because they're a nonprofit and it was considered political. So they were silent on the matter. I think it's those kinds of things that really, well, and what does it mean to, I guess the other part, so you have, you're right, people need crisis intervention daily, right? But at the same time, if your organization, and I've been a part of organizations that were guilty of this, for example, in North Carolina, getting tobacco money, so you have the RJR Reynolds family writing checks that are really small for race justice work, right? That paled in comparison to what they gave their art collection, and money that's literally got fucking blood on it, that is money from slavery, is money from selling a toxic product, literally, right? Like, I think that's the other thing that's never talked about is what did they do to get that money that they dally out to us in increments, right, to address major social issues that they're implicated in?
Yeah.
Whether it's sweatshops abroad, or whether it's environmental degradation, whether it's lack of workplace equity.
Yeah.
And what does it mean that people only want to give to nonprofits and to change work where I can write it off of my taxes? And just tell me what you think about this. And I'm sorry to harp on it. Like, I argue there's something called, progressive racism. It's kind of woke white folks. And I'd say this about men too, around gender. All these folks kind of learn about privilege, whatever kind it is, and argue the system is greased for me, and I have all these unearned, privileges, including money and resources that aren't me. If it's the gendered wage gap or the racialized wage gap, so folks will be all woke and everything, have their Black Lives Matter sign in the yard. But if you have a conversation with them, so you acknowledge that the system is giving you money that's not yours, how about redirecting that money to work, to work that's really grassroots, right? Not a fucking thing you can write a tax write-off on necessarily, right? Or you get another benefit out of this. But how about funding real change work? Lifelong, as long as you're making money in this system you say is rigged for you. And every time I've had conversations with folks about that around gender and race, it gets really, really quiet. Which, and I know it sounds really harsh, but it really kind of gets at the core of like, what are we really about? And it maybe it's not money, maybe it's time, maybe it's other resources, right? So I think that's the other thing that troubles me about the nonprofit model, besides all the political limitations, is where does the money come from? How was that money made? Is that money implicated in the work we do? And I'll use one other example, I'll shut up. I remember consulting for the YWCA in Portland, and they made the mistake of kind of jumping on the bandwagon for the $15 minimum wage. And this is 5 years ago. And as soon as one of their funders, a grocery store chain, found out about it, they made a phone call. And it's like, we don't really think you should be doing this work.
That's the funding strings. Your funders have you. I mean, that's power. How much power do you have to do the work you want to do in the way you want to do it when your funders can do that?
Well, and what would our work look like if we were generating our own funding streams? What would our work look like if we were working a part-time job in order to do the work? And what if we were doing this collectively with folks and sharing resources? And I think there's some really innovative stuff that never crosses people's minds. Like our town, I don't know about where you're at, it's full of pawn shops, right? Title loan, pawn shop, predatory lenders. Well, what if those of us that got a little capital got together and started our own pawn shop that was community-based, that the proceeds went to fund social change work? And not only that, we had interest rates that undercut these predatory lenders. So we could give you the loan at a bank rate of 10%. Again, we'd have to do the math to pay the bills and so on, right? But we could also create a couple of jobs, right, for community people, right? And basically undercut these folks that are bleeding poor people to death, but also redirect that money into the community. What if people who rent houses Section 8, who are getting subsidies every month from the federal government, what if instead of just milking rent out of people who pay the difference in the subsidy and the rent amount, right? What if folks treated that as a mortgage payment and said, you know what, I have access to these federal dollars through Section 8, and this isn't going to be rent. When in 20 years, if you're here 20 years and you pay your part for 20 years, guess what? This house is yours. You have wealth. You have wealth you can now borrow against. You have wealth that you can share and give to your kids, right? Like
we know home ownership matters. We know that.
Everything.
We know home ownership is the main determinant of the wealth gap. We know that unequivocally. So we could do that if we wanted to make that policy change. If we really wanted to eradicate race-based outcomes or wealth incomes, we would do things like that. Our policies would represent the knowledge that home ownership matters.
Well, and if we're waiting for the state to do that versus folks realize, look, how do we work the system, to
Mhm.
have different outcomes, right? But that would take people that weren't about accumulating more fucking wealth that they
Yep.
don't need,
No.
and using their power and privilege to actually transfer wealth in ethical ways,
Right.
Um,
It
so,
requires a whole paradigm shift of, rather than being about individual pockets, right? It's like the idea of individualism, which is what this all is. All of this is like, versus being community based,
yeah.
thinking about judging like the health of a person by the health of their community rather than just how much money they have in their bank account. Right. And we are motivated. I mean, like with the American dream and everything, to live in this. Think of you and your own and your family, and as if we're not connected and linked, to the community. So,
yeah. Well, and it's odd to me that, I grew up watching It's a Wonderful Life.
mhm.
You ever seen that movie?
Yeah, yeah,
Right. Which is
yeah,
kind of the dude that made it is a big propaganda film guy, right? But
yeah,
that film celebrates the idea that wealth is helping and serving your community.
yep,
That's what makes somebody wealthy. It's not the Scrooge, Mr.
yeah, yeah,
Potter, that puts all the money away. So we're this schizophrenic nation where we often have these kind of nostalgic movies or this value system up on the screen, right? You don't see much of that anymore, right? I would argue it's more
yeah,
about self-aggrandizement, but
hmm
or
yeah.
we could also just talk about the schizophrenia between people's claimed religious values and what they say about wealth accumulation and community and then what we actually live and do.
hmm Well, I think the people get fixated on, they feel like they've done enough by just saying that they're Christian, or that that's enough. I'm a Christian. So you can say that, and then therefore you can claim access to all the things that come with that identity. It's like, which could be like, I'm a good person. It becomes this like moral identity.
Yeah, but based
And
on
I'm
a base
criticizing
yeah,
that.
no,
I'm
no, I know
criticizing.
you are, but like
Yeah.
I just, again, based on a guy that was homeless who told rich people to give your shit away and follow me if you want to get into heaven. If you want to know what paradise is, don't serve yourself. And not only
Yeah.
that, love your enemies, love your neighbor like you love yourself. Like,
It's a complete contradiction. I
yeah,
mean, it's like one of probably the most egregious contradictions that is timely right now is probably that one, I think. It's such a inherent contradiction, paradox, hypocrisy, which is why I think this book, like I said, I'm only halfway into it, but it sounds like it kind of piggybacks to what you're talking about. It's called Toward a Spirituality for Global Justice, A Call to Kinship by Elaine Prevalent. So if anyone else is interested in this conversation, yeah, I'm not sure if I'm saying her last name right, but yeah, looking at how a lot of people who claim, to be Christians, what that would actually mean. And I know you've talked about this on your podcast here and there as well. So, but I think that's one of the most sort of flagrant contradictions, is how not Christ-like that actually is, to act that way and to be that way. And
well, and it seems to me kind of to come back to rape culture for just a second. I'm sorry
yeah,
we've gone down this road. It's
no,
kind of on my mind these days. It seems to me, sociologically speaking, is that we come into this world and we inherit a story, right? That
mhm,
someone else has written about who we're supposed to be, and it's a powerful, powerful story, right? As a gender scholar, like I remember
mhm,
saying things in classes when we were talking about gender or masculinity, that and asking the question, do we live in a culture where women only have value based on men's approval,
mhm.
right, or men's attraction? Like, and
Yeah,
what would it mean to have value that's not based on the male gaze,
I
or
was just going to say that. Yeah.
right, like, and where does one, where you're so bombarded by that, right, and we all are, right? Mine's
Mhm.
not necessarily the same as women's, but that my validation as a man is based on how tough I am, the stuff I accumulate, how much money I have, how many women I have, right? Like, so that's the story that I'm then supposed to live up to, that I'm pressured to live up to. But what would it mean if we wrote our own stories, or that there were better stories, you know, that would lead to more happiness and contentment and sense of connection, that connected to others and community, and that would combat alienation that I would argue is built into these stories, you know?
Yeah. Well, and that's where I think sociology, and I do, I mean, it sounds, not to romanticize it, but I do, and that's why I became a sociologist, is I think that sociology offers us tools to give us a window to break all that stuff down, like to look at the role that institutions play. I have my students do a really simple exercise during that unit on institutions, which for some people doesn't sound that sexy and exciting. I love that unit, because I have students go, okay, if I have class at like noon, I'll say, okay, whatever time you woke up, walk through and like reflect on, like jot down the way that social institutions have shaped you from like 9 o'clock from now. And you know, this is after I say, think about family, religion, media, communication, science, technology, sports, all of this, like all of our, and then they say, holy shit, by like noon, I've interacted, been shaped by, or the choices I made, the behaviors I've engaged in have been shaped by 7 institutions. I had no idea. Yeah. Because we feel like we just wake up and we just like do whatever the hell we want to do. But actually, we live in a world that is highly structured by institutions. So therefore, we're shaped by them. And I think that's what sociology does, is it gives us an opportunity to make sense of our experiences and gives us a vocabulary and a framework. And I think it's, I don't think sociologists have actualized the potential to then make changes. We've diagnosed some things and we've given like a prognosis, but I don't think we've been actually able to, you know, to then say, here's how to change it. I don't think, you know, we've gotten that far. And I think we've gotten on the career track, which we talked about last time too. Like, we don't need more research. I mean, yeah, and some things we do, and I'm a big fan of research. I do research, but we also need to start putting the research into practice.
Yeah. Well, I think the only thing I would add to it is I don't think sociologists in that moment are doing the same thing that you would ask your students generally. Like, how am you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Because that conversation's happening in an institutional setting, right?
Yeah, that too.
Yeah, one of because you know, I don't know if you ever got pushback on that, because again, people want to think that they're nonconformist and that they're individuals and they're making all these choices. And what I would just generally do is go, okay, if you think you're making choices, how about getting a piece of paper out and let's just do a little exercise and number 1 to 10. And if you would just on number 1, write, I just got a piece of paper out and numbered it from 1 to 10 because it's institutional, right? Like, I mean,
right.
You know, like it's happening in that fucking moment, right? Because you're listening to the white guy at the head of the room, and you're here because your parents want you here, and you're here because you think you're gonna, you know. But I think the only thing about that, though, and this is what I wanted to ask you. Is it a curse, though? Is it a, and I'm sure you felt this way, and this is, I've had so many students tell me this, and I think they go back to sleep after years of not thinking sociologically. But all of a sudden, you know, I think when sociology is taught well, people see things very, very differently, and then they see some things that they never saw before. And a lot of it they can't do anything about, or it's too big, right?
Yeah, it's the constant burden. Like a student said once, it's like a can of worms just opened up and I can't put it back on. Like you ruined everything. And, you know, I've had students, say that. Like, I don't watch TV the same way. I don't go to the hairdresser the same way. I don't have conversations. I don't think of my relationship. I've had some breakups. People were like, I'm thinking about stuff now in a whole new way.
And who do I talk to about that? Like, who do I get with to combat some of it? You know, what happens to our relationships when we challenge our parents about sexism or race, right? Like, you know, and again, I know folks want to feel like we change hearts and minds, and I think that's true to some degree, but those same people that for that 15 weeks, right? And I think some of it really sticks and it can be transformative,
Mhm.
but then you go out into this world where most folks haven't, to go back to your phrase, been self-reflective at all.
Mhm.
You know, one of the things I kind of push local academics about when they're talking to me about local issues is like, this lingo we use in the academy means nothing other than talking points among conservative local folk who have never sat in a college classroom.
Yeah.
And that's not to say they don't know something's wrong, because I feel like they do, right?
Mhm.
But I guess that's all to say, and it kind of goes back to change. Like all of a
Mhm.
sudden, these folks now have a lens to see things differently from, which conservatives would call indoctrination,
Yeah.
right? Or un-American or
Victim, like
anti-male,
we teach
or
people to be victims, like we're
yeah,
teaching
to teach them to be
women to be,
victims or to be hateful, you know, and
yeah,
racist and prejudiced and reverse racists and
yeah,
right. Um, yeah.
yeah. Well, and I mean, there is a
What do you, well, let's just deal with me and you. What do you do with that? What have
when
you, like, how do you navigate, um, like the world, a patriarchal world? How do you navigate rape culture? Like, how do you,
Mhm. That's a really good question. It definitely shapes the interactions that I have with people, you know, in terms of engaging with people who I want to. Like my sort of social
yeah,
world has gotten a lot smaller as I, you know, because you don't have the energy and time to constantly fight every battle, and it's exhausting, right? When you do have a lens where you see everything in context and everything is layers, and you see the backstory and landscape, right? I mean, it's easier to kind of have this, right? It's a lot harder to have this where you see how everything fits together, and you know, and with that is, you know, it can be exhausting. So I like to gravitate towards like-minded people, you know, but I don't live in a bubble. My kids, I have two young kids, you know, and we have conversations like you know, and they live, you wouldn't know their mother was a radical feminist sociologist, honestly. Most days they're kids, they're in public schools, they're in mainstream society, they watch YouTube videos. So I ask a lot of questions and we have a lot of conversations. That's what I do, is I ask a ton of questions. And we talk about why they think certain things or why they feel certain ways about, you know, people or about places. You know, like my son just said to me a few weeks ago, I think we might have talked about this. He said, I was like, this is such a critical age. He said he's starting to feel intimidated by, he goes, you know, I feel a little bit scared and intimidated by older Black teenage boys. So we talked about that. I was like, well, like where and like how, like what makes you feel intimidated? Like, what are you intimidated by? He's like, I don't know. Like, I just feel like a little bit physically like intimidated. So part of that, right, is like talking to him about that. I was like, well, he's developing a racial consciousness. I mean, he's 11, he's in 5th grade, and we have conversations about a lot of things. We talk about gender identity, we talk about sexual identity, and, you know, there's really not much that's off limits. So I just kind of, you know, talked to him about where that comes from, why he feels that way, and just asked him questions. I didn't have to like indoctrinate him.
yeah,
I just asked him
yeah.
questions so then he can form his own view of certain things, you know? So that's what I try to do. And I have my outlets with teaching and having those spaces. And I don't fight every battle. I let more things go now than I used to. I mean, when I was coming into my like righteousness, my sort of like racial justice identity and gender justice and everything else, it was like I was ready to roll up my sleeves at anyone who said anything or didn't say something, you know. But then over time I just sort of, you know, and I tell my students, not every battle is worth fighting. What do you do?
I drink a lot.
I
I do.
have rum in my coffee. No.
Yeah, no, I do some of the same. I mean, like you, I am very selective about who I give my limited energy to.
Yeah.
You know, on my better days, I also just do things that remind me of my smallness, like gardening and being in nature.
Yeah.
But there is, I mean, well, and spiritually, I think, and spiritual, I mean, I don't necessarily mean metaphysical, even though that might be out there. I've gotten to where I talk to my elders, hoping there's something out there listening.
Mm-hmm.
And I ask for help, and maybe the psychological act of asking for help, particularly as things heat up, right?
Yeah.
But you know, I do that. I also spend time reminding myself and listening to people who are way smarter and more courageous than me. You know, some of my go-tos are Fannie Lou Hamer, James Baldwin,
Yeah.
like people who stood up when it was, who were brutalized, when she was sterilized, you know, sexually assaulted, and just stood up anyway. Like, there are so many folks that I look to that were just fully authentic and said what needed to be said in the most dangerous of times. And probably caught hell from every imaginable side because they were rocking the boat, you know, and they weren't staying in their place.
Yeah.
Right. So I really do draw sustenance from those people as I read their stuff, or I listen to an interview with them, and I'm reminded, you know, that there's something bigger. There's, you know, and not only that, that I'm the benefactor of what they did, that my life is incredibly rich across lines that I'm not supposed to cross, because of their fearlessness. So I think all those things, and at the same time, it's incredibly lonely and alienating, especially in the deep South.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I would say like nature for me, as I've gotten older too, has been more of a source of food, you know, in that way for me, that kind of helps me like reset. And, you know, the idea that we are like a part of something bigger than our systems.
yeah.
In reading, you know, like, and I think what reading is feeling the connection. Like when we're reading, we're not only connecting to the ideas that somebody's written, but we connect to them. So I think we crave that, you know. I think we long for that connection. And for me right now in my life, it's reading, you know, ideas that I find stimulating, and, you know, things that so I definitely can relate to that, feeling like you need to find your sources where they are, you know, keep things going, and just having fun too. You know, I like to have fun. I like music. I like going out and meeting people and being social. You know, I am a social person. Less so as I've gotten older because I am more selective, you know, but yeah. So all those things. I like to have a full range.
Yeah.
Yep. So did we go enough into rape culture part 2? I mean, do you think we
I
kind
don't
of hit
know.
that?
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, we're basically talking about the air we breathe, right? And
Yeah.
you know, you mentioned that it's kind of just what's considered normal, so it gets justified in ways. We talked about it being individualized to pathological people instead of no. And there's a way we throw those folks under the bus, right?
Yeah.
Well, and I guess the question I have about it is, I know it's still being taught, I imagine, on college campuses, but there's a full onslaught against the academy. I don't know if this has happened in North Carolina, but there was a Georgia State rep that demanded to see every syllabus at Valdosta State that had the words privilege or power in them. And they produced them. So this CRT thing is serious.
Power. I mean, privilege, I get why they say that. I don't agree, but power.
Well, what's funny about it is they didn't kind of weigh in that a lot of professors across all kinds of disciplines use PowerPoints. So evidently they got hundreds and hundreds of.
That's actually kind of funny.
It is pretty damn funny. It's what they deserve.
Yeah.
And so much for academic freedom. I mean, we're really and this is what scares the shit out of me about liberal folks at the academy. Nobody ever says, no, I'm not doing it. And I've seen the academy just acquiesce over and over and over in my 20 years there. And the point I always ask folks is like, where's your line? What's the line that you're not willing to cross? So this kind of backlash counter movement to all that critical theory is alive and well.
What are they doing with the syllabi now? Like, what's the charge? What's
I
to say
honestly
they have to eliminate
know.
it?
It could just be a symbolic move to send the president, and administration a message about put people on a leash or you're not going to get your money. So I'm not sure where it's going. It's very McCarthy-esque, right?
Get your faculty in line, or like this can't become known as like a hotbed of liberal indoctrination or
left-wing communist indoctrination.
Yeah.
But that happened last term here.
Yeah.
So I say that to say, and this is another thing that disturbs me. We had the various trips to Washington by women, right after Trump was elected, and rape culture was really on the map. Me Too is on the map, but and I don't listen to mainstream news very much. I'll check CNN out and the Fox and so forth, but I don't like it's as if now that Biden's in office, who had some sexual assault allegations levied at him, right, that went unaddressed by Democrats. But, is it still in the ether, I guess, especially in the dominant discourse?
And
men's work in general, or is all that kind of background now that the Democrats are in charge?
I don't think Me Too is going anywhere. I don't think the move, the sort of shift to expect and to push things, like that, problematizing sexual assault and problematizing sexual harassment. I don't think that is going to go anywhere. I don't know if it's going to create radical change in terms of how men actually behave in public, in the workplace, in their families. I'm seeing a lot more focus right now on racial justice in terms of policy and in terms of, workplaces and educational settings. But I don't think Me Too is going to go anywhere as a movement. And I mean, I just wanted to say, if anyone is interested in rape culture as a topic, this book, Asking For It by Kate Harding, and also the Insight anthology. Insight is a fantastic radical feminist organization, women of color, who have been writing about sexual violence and violence against women for a really long time. And I just wanted to kind of put those plugs in if anyone wants to learn more about rape culture and about violence against women and how it's normalized. The other thing too, that somebody reached out to me last year to do an interview about like rape scenes in television shows and the increase in them. And Game of Thrones, I know there's a lot of Game of Thrones. Yeah, so an article just came out. I think her name is Sophie Green or Sophie something, just published a piece in the Atlantic about Game of Thrones and the sort of regular sexual degradation of women on that show as a part of just her critique is that it's not radical. Literally, this is she says something like, and this is so true, because you'll see this even in sci-fi films where it's like science fiction is the cultural sexual scripts are like anything you want them to be. Like, we're talking about science fiction, create a world that doesn't exist. And then we see the same tired sexual tropes about women, about sexual violence. It's the same thing.
Right.
She's like, literally in Game of Thrones, people are fighting dragons. And why are we still seeing the same representation of male domination over women and these like tired characters? Like, anything is possible when you're fighting dragons. So why are you relying on this like really old and tired? Like, we can't imagine another way. It's such a part of our culture that even when we're creating fiction, we can't unsee that. We can't unknow that reality. That's just,
well, it's
really,
also it's formulaic too, right? Like how culture reinforces itself, it seems to me, because I think we might have said this in the first time we chatted, like we never talk about why we find it entertaining. Whether it's war, violence, like what, why is that entertaining to us? What does that expose that we find violence so entertaining?
as voyeurs of like violence, to see people being cruel to each other.
Well, and I remember, this is no lie, I was dating somebody one time and she'd watch some of the most violent stuff in the world. Not, I love her to death, don't get me wrong, but not really be moved. And the only time I ever saw her get incredibly upset was in a movie where an elephant was being abused by a trainer, and it was fictional.
Yeah.
Right. And she started sobbing uncontrollably. And I was just shocked because we had watched a bunch of different stuff. Right.
Yeah.
But and you see this a lot, and there's some discussion about why it's the case, but why humans are moved when other animals are abused, but when humans are being abused and slaughtered and killed and raped, like we again aren't moved by it, literally,
Right.
So it seems to me that the Game of Thrones was just gratuitous violence and erotica and the same old shit,
Yeah.
But that's what we love, as a culture.
I watched the opening scene of the first episode and I walked out of the room and said, I'm not watching this. I deal with violence. I think I was working at the Domestic Violence Coalition. And I said, I think someone got beheaded. And then there was like this gratuitous, it was like and I just said, I deal with real violence, like on a very real level of people in our communities who are like survivors of violence. I don't want to watch this shit on a Sunday night, and it was so gross to me. It was such like a gross use of, I don't know. And I don't like seeing violence, and I don't like seeing people perpetrate violence against each other.
Yeah. Like, when it may speak to the fact that like the consumers of it have it. I mean, I've had the same feelings about police dramas, about hospital shows where there's gore. I mean, my family members have had chronic illness. I've spent hours and hours in hospitals. I don't want to, it's not a form of entertainment.
Yeah.
But yeah, like it's, well, and it raises the question back to the dominant nature and normative nature of rape culture, is that one, it goes back to the documentary question you asked me, is that if it doesn't reinforce the dominant tropes, can you even make the film, right? Can you, like, will it be especially for folks trying to make money at a box office, right? I've argued for the longest time that you can't make movies about American history, right, that are accurate, because nobody will pay to see them. Because we'll have to feel something. We'll have to confront the atrocities that have been committed, right? And who's going to make those movies? What producer, what production company is going to back them financially? Like,
right.
Like, there's this automatic default censorship again in capitalism that it has to sell, it has to produce a profit to generally be created, right?
Yeah, I mean, Game of Thrones, they sell pillowcases, coffee mugs, beer koozies, I mean, socks, T-shirts. It's a commodity. I mean, it makes money. So they did push, they were apparently responded to a lot of the backlash and critiques they got about their gratuitous. It's sort of like a shallow term to say it, but anyway, the rape scenes, they had so many rape scenes and people were like, you've got to, starting to get backlash. So they made changes to it.
Yeah.
But it's still, it's gross.
The truth is I saw them all, and I saw them all because my students were constantly talking about them. Right.
Mhm.
And I don't know if you like teaching, I got to a point where I was off the back with popular culture. So like I made some deliberate decisions, but I remember, saying to them, oh, this is really innovative. So there's a white woman queen that's in charge of all these black eunuch. I mean, the racial shit in it, the misogynistic stuff in it. And not only that, what is our love affair with this genre of, I guess it was originally books, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
This form of fantasy.
Well, some would argue that, the feminization of society is softening us and that we're drawn to these sort of like hyper masculine, where even the women characters are like, bloodthirsty, like heroes and heroines, and that we're all on our computers craving, that sort of like adventure and primal, I don't know, like violence.
It's the blasé nature of modern life, that we're all kind of catatonic drones as we live lives. Our lives live us instead of we live them.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I find it fascinating that most of us are trying to escape our lives all the time, whether it's entertainment or drugs or alcohol or fucking CrossFit. Like,
if you start picking on slow pitch softball, I'm gonna come after you.
No, like but you know what I mean? Like,
I need my softball.
I mean, how many of us?
We need outlets. We need coping mechanisms. I think hope is a way that we cope, by saying like we're hopeful. I think we need to get through the day. Humans need coping mechanisms.
Oh my God, do you hear yourself though? Do you hear like get through the day?
Yeah.
Like what, I mean, but that to me again is, how do we
not all days?
Not all days. I know, but like, again, someone told me recently that I needed to take a vacation, and I was like, I don't believe in vacations. I believe in living a life that I don't need to escape. And so what I'm trying to do is, well, how do you create a life you don't want to escape or you don't need a break from?
Yeah.
Like, it seems to me that that's a much more kind of healthy way to try to think about things than, and this is my concern with a lot of we're getting way off topic here, but mental health practitioners and so forth. Like, it seems to me kind of like the discussion of men and rape culture and the demonizing of those folks, right? Versus looking at it as a cultural issue. A lot of times we are trying to get people medicated and willing to fit into society when they're not the problem. The society is the problem.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
There's a way we individualize all this shit, particularly in the realm of mental health. So if you're depressed, it's not that the world's on fire and that there's, massive inequality and that there's massive polarization and nobody's talking about it. It's not that we're alienated. It's take some Wellbutrin.
Yeah. Right.
It's you, like, versus no, let's change this shit. What does a community look like? What is the world we want? What communities we want? What y'all are doing this with Work for Change? Like, what does meaningful work look like? How do we get that again? Can we get that again in this economic system?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think that that's important too, is to not, right. We're medicalizing a lot because, people might hate their jobs and they're miserable with monogamy or a job that's unfulfilling, like all these things that we've created. I don't agree with the fact that like I want to have a week when I don't have to be mom, like when you have a life where you don't get to do what you want to do because you have obligations and responsibilities to others.
Yeah.
You need to tap out. Like when you're a caretaker for an elderly person, when you take care of a special needs child, or when you have things that pull you, and that's a very gendered nature of work.
Right.
Not that men don't serve in those caring roles, but women who are caretakers need to tap out, or people in general have to just tap out and say, like, I need to go somewhere where I don't have to be needed for a week, where I can just go listen to music, drink a beer on the beach. I'm all for that. Go for a hike on a mountain, like whatever, or a staycation, or whatever it is.
But what if our lives were structured differently, where people weren't feeling like they're the ones that get pulled in every different direction, right? Which is both gender, but also, you know, when you have a nuclear family that doesn't stay close to their parents, right? Because the job takes them to another city versus no. And you know, you're in the situation, right? Like, like this is a society that doesn't give a shit about community or family, right? It gives a shit about people producing for the affluent.
Incredibly isolating.
And all I'm pushing back on is that there is this way, especially with individualism, and I'll use a specific example. For the longest time, I've been trying to get friends of mine to go, let's buy land or multiple things in the same neighborhood. Let's go back to this idea that we're neighbors, right? And not only that, that means we don't have to have 3 fucking cars. That doesn't mean, you know, why don't we get on each other's cell phone plan? Why don't we like get creative where we take some of the pressure off of ourselves, right? And not only that, you want me to watch your kids this weekend? You know, like there's all these ways that we could, if we had real community, right? If we were living in a value system and writing a story that someone else hasn't written for us or didn't show us on television in the form of a commercial, and sell us a fucking lifestyle, right? Not even products anymore, but sell us a lifestyle that involves a Subaru Outback and fucking titanium walking sticks. You know, maybe we wouldn't all feel like we had, you know, we wouldn't feel exhausted and expended and pulled in every different direction, and we would get some support, you know. So I guess that's, I get it, but it still seems that need is a consequence of these larger arrangements to me, you know. And it's weird because I've offered to be with some folks' kids.
So you want to come watch my kids, and after a week,
I'm going to, I'm supposed to a week, right? So, you know, but it's been interesting that even when some of us approach our friends who are parents, right, coupled and not coupled, and go, yo, we'll watch kids this weekend, go like, and it's not that we're creepy pedophiles or anything, but like, I think folks don't even know what to do when it's offered a lot of times, especially if you're not going to take any money. I mean, that's just a sad commentary when, look, you're struggling. I get it. Like, you know, let me help. I've got a friend with a new dog, and it's, you know, and I have a very flexible schedule. And I said, look, you know, I know you're puppy training. Let me drop by. Oh, I'll get it. So they take off work 3 times a day. Let the dog out. So you get my drift. Again, it's back to this individualism.
Like, I take a lot on. I don't ask for help. I am like really bad. I'm working on that, of being less. I have totally internalized the individualism in my, like, the way that I live my life. Like, no, I got it. I can do it. I'm strong. I'm this, you know, independent. I don't need anybody. I'm self-reliant. Oh yeah, I've totally.
Even as a feminist.
Yeah. Well, that's a part of it. A part of the, I mean, you know, second wave feminism was that was kind of what I cut my teeth on in college, which was, you can be on the same playing field as men. You can be smarter, faster, stronger, you know, more independent.
And what I would say about it, and you can die as quickly as they do from heart disease and depression.
That's what I'm saying. Like now, you know, 20 years later, I've, you know, my thinking has shifted absolutely. But that was sort of,
When this goes back to an initial point we were talking about, maybe before we push record, was that is the point of social justice to get people in these systems that might kill them, you know, or that encourages them to turn their back on everybody else. Right. That's not what King was fighting for.
No.
That's not what, you know, a bunch of people were. It wasn't to integrate into a way of life that's not
assimilation. No.
You know. So whether that's just capitalism or whether that's consumption or whether that's,
Yeah.
male dominance, all those things.
Yeah, no, it's about creating a better way, not just fitting more people into the existing way.
Well, I think the other part of that is we don't have enough faith in our own capacity to design it for ourselves and come together and go, what does it look like? What does a school system look like that serves all students? And it's exciting to be a part of it, both as an educator and as a student. What we are, I mean, if I've learned anything about challenging power, whether it's a college or university or a city government, most people in power are incompetent and uncreative. I would argue they got there because they were good at keeping the institution stable and doing what it does, right? But they're not good at developing actually innovative policy, and it's not their fault, right? It's just the limitation of their experience, right?
Yeah.
So,
well, and then once you get there, you're going to do what you can to stay there, which means you're going to play
absolutely.
by the rules of the game, which are in place. Otherwise, you get out. You know what I mean? You'll get booted out.
Yeah. And not only that, if your identity is based on that, if your story is based on that story of, oh, I've made it now that I'm the president of the university or the mayor or whoever else,
Yeah.
the proposition that maybe you didn't make it, maybe there's something else to make that's not defined by, other people.
Yeah.
That may not even make sense to other people. It may even threaten the dominant culture, right? I think the real innovative, creative, liberating stuff is a utter threat to this machine.
Well, because it doesn't have a price tag on it. You know what I mean? If we could think outside of that, where things get commodified, everything is an object to sell, and everything is,
and the system doesn't know
consumption.
The system also doesn't know how to relate to it. I just remember Occupy, which Obama kind of crushed in a way. The media kept going, well, who's the leader? And people were going, there isn't one. Well, and that meant that it was unorganized. Well, that organized in the dominant culture sense, but folks are like, no, we're decentralizing this thing. We know what y'all do to leaders.
Yep.
Right. And not only that, it's
they
more,
can be plucked.
and demonized and criminalized and, locked up or killed or whatever else. Right. I'd say the same thing about BLM to some degree, because most BLM people I know weren't paid, didn't get those millions of corporate dollars. Right. They're just everyday folk. Right. So decentralization doesn't make sense to this dominant culture, like rejecting, like taking more money than you need doesn't, or redirecting that money. As I said, with kind of white progressive racists that know everything to say, but when it comes down to institutional change and supporting it, they're still addicted to money.
Yeah. Well, there's a whole business of social change work. I mean, from nonprofits, to consultancies, and where people are
writing, all of it, right?
Which I do have mixed. I mean, I feel like when you've got good ideas that can be helpful, that can be used to implement change, you want to not share them. Yeah. Right? I mean, I don't think.
This is the other thing I wonder about, though. Can you think of a lot of examples where people actually changed because of, dramatic examples, I guess, by choice?
Anyway, like organizations that change by choice,
or just individuals, like, and this is really a question, it's not a statement. Like in my life, if I'm honest with myself, generally I didn't change until something happened that really forced change. Right now, in terms of significant change, and not only that, the people in my life, and I think I've told you before, my mom used to complain about my dad all the time, and they were divorced, been divorced for almost 30 years. And she just dog him out every time I visit her, even though she was remarried. And, and I just kept begging her to please stop dogging out my dad. You got to divorce him. He's still my dad. Like, I'm not here visiting him, I'm visiting you. So, and she just couldn't do it. And so I, after begging and getting mad and screaming and shouting, now it's like, look, I'm going to leave if you keep doing this, and I'll come back, but if when I'm visiting you, you bring this up, I'm going to leave because I'm not doing this with you.
Mhm.
And so, you know, she says yes. And I come and visit, and she starts talking about my dad, and I just pick my shit up and start heading towards the
Just
door.
left.
And
Yeah.
she's like, where are you going? I was like, we talked about this. I'll see you next week. I love you. Dude, took twice of me walking out, and that was it. No more dad talk. Like after years of begging and pleading, you know, it's kind of like alcohol
That's how I
anonymous.
parent. It's just a series of threats. No, I mean,
Yeah, well, no, we
actions have
change our
consequences.
behavior. You change your behavior, and you
Yeah.
throw the system into, you know, so
You-
divorces do this,
Yeah.
right? People getting fired from jobs causes change. And
Yeah.
I just bring that up because when I look at the substantial changes in the country's history, a lot of them were people really forcing the issue. You know, all the movement stuff. It wasn't like the country had an epiphany around women voting or around ending slavery or lynching or Jim Crow segregation, or it was only when people took to the streets and said no more.
Disruption. That's the only, it has to be a disruption, whether you're talking about a pattern of communication in the case of your mom, or a disruption to how people have access to voting, or, you know, you have to disrupt the pattern.
Well, and I think we frame that as bad, but it's kind of classic kind of Al-Anon behavior that, you know, if you have a substance abusing partner, and your behaviors enabled and excuse that, because you're waiting for them to wake up and change. I mean, the epiphany of that, and this is the same thing in any kind of abusive situation, is if you're waiting on them to change, good luck.
Yeah.
Right. But so, and not only that, you have no power over that to some degree.
Mhm.
What you have power over is you. Right. So what can you do? Which then forces change, right?
Yeah.
Whether, not that you necessarily intentionally do that, but it's more about boundaries. It's more about, you know, look, you go do your thing, but I'm doing X.
Yep.
And then the dance is interrupted. And I
And
think
then
that plays out politically too.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that's even in like a chemical way, like when you change chemical property, like that's what happens. Like that's chemistry shifts when you add something, you take something out. And I think behavior works in that similar way. Yeah. I mean, change begets change too. I think change in one area, you know, can create change in some other areas. So.
Well, and a great example, going back to Me Too for just a second, is I think Me Too was dramatically powerful because when the Weinsteins and the Matt Lauers and even Tavis Smiley, like these guys, have you heard from any of them? No, there was a message, if nothing else, like the message was, okay, maybe you're incapable of seeing us as human beings, but guess what? When you work here, you better fake it. There's just some shit we ain't going to tolerate anymore. And the line was drawn. And man, it was powerful.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, powerful.
Yeah, that was there was a turning point.
Because people were no longer silent. They did something that they normally didn't do. They stepped up, and that created a chain, right? Like that other people were, oh yeah, me too. Like, like literally.
Well, and I mean, people had been stepping up for years, but had been silent, right? Things get brushed under the rug. There's a culture of silence, which would take it and go, well, we're going to put that in the HR file. Yeah, come to find out, Charlie wrote like the file of the HR file is like 25 years long, but there isn't a process in place to deal with it, to actually take it seriously, or to, you know, what's that saying? Policy without accountability is just paper. If you have a policy that says we don't tolerate sexual harassment, or, you know, but then you don't actually do anything to enforce it or to hold people accountable, then it's just it's just words on paper. And
has anybody done an analysis of why Me Too at that moment was able to, because there had to be kind of like Rosa Parks. There were many Rosa Parks, right? We don't know about because they got their ass beat on the bus or arrested, and
but that was right.
This moment, this coalescence of forces, the, you know, King, SCLC, the 1950 Civil Rights Movement. But has anybody that you know of done kind of a look at why Me Too at that particular moment
just blew up?
Yeah.
Would it have been pre like 2016? Because I'm trying to think about, was it after the Women's March no, it was before, because then the Women's March, I think, kind of grew out of the Me Too, was a part of that. I'm trying to think of the timeline. Social media, I think, played a role in just taking this moment and just broadcasting it, in a variety of platforms. There probably is an analysis, but I don't know of it. So that would be a good conversation. Like,
Yeah.
what creates these moments? Like, how do the right conditions align up that does create this like cultural reckoning?
Yeah. Would be, I mean, given what we've been talking about with change and why change happens, it seems like, and I, I think there's a magic to all that too, that's not predictable. Like, movements happen at weird times, but it just makes me wonder, what kind of coalesced. Like, was it the use of social media? Was it women connecting on social media? Was it a willingness to litigate? Because the EEOC and others have been around for all this time. Like you said, there's been policy about hostile workplaces, but or was it the fact that some of the most powerful men in media, in Fox, with Charlie Rose, with, like, when they went down, that sent a message out to the local shop owner male that's been doing the same thing, that holy cow, if they can be taken out.
Like a domino. Like, that was a very symbolic. I mean, for me, it was like Weinstein. When that happened, it was like, wow, like, people are like,
well, and we're talking about people who control media being outed, right? Because it'd be so fascinating. Like, you're talking about an interesting documentary, right? Like, how did, because I remember CBS and others being reluctant to kind of own up, and then having to do damage control
after.
Like, and like, overnight, all of a sudden, Matt Lauer's not there. Overnight, Charlie Rose is not there. Overnight, Tavis is off of PBS, and like, folks are having to talk about it. Like,
because that requires a discussion, that requires follow-up, like, what happened, and
where's Steve?
What happened? I know, that would be a great.
Well, and those were people that had been doing that in those industries forever. Those industries had been protecting them, right, forever. And then something like, have you seen Bombshell, about the whole Fox thing?
No, I haven't. Did you see it?
No, it's on Netflix and a variety of other things, but it's the whole Fox thing with Roger Ailes. I think Roger Ailes, right? It makes me now want to watch it, because I'm just like, what the heck happened?
Yeah, I know. Well, and the timing, like you said, like, what was it? I think about, and I would tell students this as well, like, we were, in a protest era. I think about, March for Our Lives, the youth movement against gun violence, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Women's March, right? Me Too, like, we're these sort of movements. Like, but you're saying, like, how did Me Too itself kind of get really big? And I think social media did play a role in that. And it was one of those issues that brought people together across generations, across racial and ethnic group and socioeconomic status. It's one of those unifying issues. Like, I remember one of my Me Too moments, I was with my mother. Like, and these young teenagers just like heckled at us, like swore at us. And I'm with my mother. I was in my 30s. She was in her, her late 50s, early, I'm like, at what age, at what point does this stop? Do we not get like verbally assaulted on the street by teenagers calling us effing whores when I'm with my mother walking by my high school in my hometown? They thought we were, similarly aged women, they were driving up behind us, and it wasn't physical, but being like verbally, like just those sort of like verbal, and then we've all, so I think it was one of those that everyone was like, yeah, me too, me too, me too. It didn't matter how old you were, or how young you were. Everyone, has had that kind of experience, physically, emotionally, verbally.
Do you also wonder, I mean, I think there was some actually across the political spectrum stuff too. especially given that women that were working for
Oh
Fox.
yeah, like
you know.
yeah. I think it is, and that is one of those unifying issues, like sexual harassment. I don't think any conservative is like for sexual,
Yeah.
right? It is one of those issues that I think does bring people across lines
Well,
because,
and that's
yeah.
not to say some conservatives don't excuse it, because they certainly do. And some female conservatives will, I mean, because that goes back to the naturalizing that this is just what men do argument. You know?
Yeah. You're just overreacting, or, you know, you should be flattered that they think you're attractive, and, you know, comments like that, like women should be flattered by it.
Right. And that's, you know, the Trump phenomenon too, right?
Yep. Yeah. Well, he gave that sort of, opened that up, you know, for men who always felt that way and acted that way. But
Well, and this is my thing,
now
is how asinine it all is when he says it's locker room talk. Dude, you weren't in a locker room. You're getting off a
Yeah.
damn bus. How can it be? No, it's getting off the bus talk.
Yeah, no, like you're not in a locker room. First of all, it's
Can't be
not
like,
okay there, but you're
yeah,
not. You're on
yeah.
a bus filming a television
Yeah,
show.
there's cameras around you, and you're
You have a
just
mic.
saying it. So no,
I
it's just,
know.
you know, just like, you know.
Yeah. False parallels. And it's, yeah, it's just not accurate at all. So,
Hey, I know we went all over the place with this today, but maybe this is a good place to stop, and
yeah. Oh,
we'll do
yeah,
it
I know.
again, because I really want to talk about individualism with you.
Yeah. Okay.
I think it's so dangerous, you know, just so dangerous, and
Yeah.
so normative too. But, and that's not to minimize kind of the issue of rape culture and patriarchy and all that.
Mhm.
It's a part.
Well,
I think it's part of it.
yeah. Well, yeah. And I think it takes us far away from humanity too, because I think when we're really in a, you know, being like fully human and actualizing that, we are communal. I don't think we are meant to be individual, you know, like isolated from each other. And I think, yeah. So yeah, let's
Well,
part
that, and
3.
you know, I need other people to know who I am. Like I have a story in my head about who I am, but everybody I talk to tells me a very different story that's very intriguing.
Wait, about you?
Yeah, I think we can't know ourselves without other people's perspectives,
Oh
because
yeah.
we just bullshit ourselves, right? And we might be delusional. So I, you know, or we just, again, I see the world through a white male, you know, body, and that's a limited perspective. And, you know, when I have people who are different from me, they've got a different, totally take this as legitimate and often more accurate than my own.
Well, you've been shaped by your life experiences. I think we're aware of how we've been shaped by life experiences and unaware. I think there are things, and I think it's meant to be. I don't think we're aware. We have blind spots, or we might not realize we come across certain ways to people because we're not experiencing ourselves the way people experience us. That would be like, you know, so, and I think that, yeah, sure. So next time I'll interview you so we can learn about you.
That
So,
would be really boring, probably, but
hey, I have good interviewing skills. So,
I'm not putting it on the interview. I'm putting it on myself.
yeah.
Plus, I talk about my crap on this thing all the time. So,
All right. Fair enough.
yeah. Well, cool. Well, thank
Okay.
you for today.
Sure.
Again, I'm just leaving more questions than answers, but I appreciate the conversation and the time.
Questions are good. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm gonna pause it.